All right, now to give us more perspective in terms of what this moment is playing out as part of this Kursk incursion, we're being joined by Mr. Maximilian Hess, who is a Central Asia Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and author of Economic War, Ukraine and the Global Conflict Between Russia and the West. He's joining us live from London. Mr. Hess, let me in fact start off by asking you with some reports that have quite clearly pointed out to the use of the British-donated Challenger 2 tanks that are being used by the Ukrainians in carrying out this incursion into Kursk. How is the British government looking at a potential fallout for the fact that Ukraine is using these British-given weapons? Is Britain willing to accept any ramifications that may result out of an escalation?
Well, certainly, and thank you very much for having me. What is clear is it's not just British tanks that have been used, U.S. Stryker vehicles, German Marauder tanks as well. Canada acknowledged today that some Canadian equipment had come out, and the Canadians said very clearly that we don't place any geographic restrictions on the Ukrainians. Other countries have been much more circumspect. In Germany, there's been a very lively debate about it. Here in the U.K., they've been relatively clear. But I think that this is not likely to result in any kind of direct escalation from Russia. Russia certainly has carried out intelligence, even sabotage activity in NATO countries in the course of this conflict, but I don't expect that this will lead to a direct retaliation from Russia, certainly not against the West.
You know, the Russians would of course turn around and say that because these countries are giving weapons that are being used on Russian territory against Russia, the logistical transport facilities of transporting these weapons could be targeted before they're brought into Ukraine. How do the Western nations respond to that?
Well, in some ways, it's kind of the boy who cried wolf phenomenon. This isn't the first time the Russians have said this. They've also made a lot of noise around nuclear escalation. The more and more you use those threats, the more meaningless it is. But also there's been an increased acknowledgement, and we've seen this through reporting, citing intelligence sources, of just the extent of Russian activity in Europe. We saw this just now with the prisoner swap for the Western journalist, Evan Gershkovich. A few Russian dissidents were swapped for a number of Russian intelligence officers, including one, Vadim Krasikov, who had assassinated an asylum seeker in Berlin in broad daylight, had been sentenced to death, and the Kremlin had denied it. Of course, now they've admitted it and treated him to a hero's welcome. So there's more of an acknowledgement publicly that Russia already has carried out deadly attacks on the West, unperceived political enemies, including a bombing campaign in Spain last year.
All right, and also the fact that, Ukraine has in fact come forth and said that the reason why it has carried out the incursion into Kursk is for the Russians to negotiate on fair terms. Do you think when the negotiations are held in the wake of the Kursk incursion, the Russians would be willing to negotiate with the Ukrainians on what Ukraine sees as fair terms?
So no, I certainly don't think the Russians are likely to do that, and I think Putin is still a very far way away from negotiations, and those have to be negotiations from a position of strength, because otherwise Putin will just use them to build time to attack again. We've seen very clearly from the beginning of this war, when he launched it, his aims are to take Kiev, Kharkiv, Zaporozhye, Odessa. These are cities with millions more people than in the territory Russia currently occupies, all the way up to the main river, the Dnieper, that bisects Ukraine, and taking the entire south. And those agendas and operations will continue, sadly.
All right, we'll have to leave there. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Hess, for joining us and getting us that perspective there.
Thank you for having me.
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.